I knew something was wrong long before the words ever left their mouths, because a mother feels the shift before anyone else does. It begins quietly, like a draft under a closed door, the kind you can't quite see but you feel it beneath your skin. A coldness that settles deeper each time your children start talking to you like a responsibility instead of a person. I first felt it last November, the day my daughter Emily called me with a voice so unnaturally bright that I knew she was hiding something. She talked about holiday plans, about decorations, about how excited her two boys were for Christmas this year, and I waited for her to invite me the way she had since the day she had her first child. Instead, she kept talking around the subject, like someone circling a wound they were too afraid to press. When she finally said she wanted to try something different this year, I felt my stomach sink, but I still held my voice steady, soft, encouraging, pretending I didn't already know where this was going. My son Matthew followed 2 days later, just as rehearsed, just as falsely cheerful, telling me that since their father's new wife Kelly had such a big house and a taste for holiday hosting, the kids thought it would be nice to spend Christmas there for a change. They said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage, hoping I would just smile and nod and make it easy for them. They didn't say they were replacing me. They didn't say they chose the woman who had been in their lives for only 3 years over the woman who had raised them for 30. They said words like convenience and bigger space and modern traditions, as if I didn't know these were excuses meant to soften the blow. They thought they were delivering the news gently, but it felt like someone slowly closing a door in my face, inch by inch, pretending it wasn't intentional. I didn't cry when I hung up. I didn't protest. I didn't beg for a seat at a table that I built with my own hands. I smiled the entire time, even though they couldn't see me, because I wanted them to feel comfortable while they eased their mother out of the life she created for them. They had no idea that every word they spoke was a thread snapping in a rope I had held alone for years. I spent the rest of that night sitting at my dining table, staring at the chair where each of them used to sit when they were little, remembering how their feet couldn't even touch the floor as they kicked their legs under the table while they waited for cookies to cool. I remembered Matthew tugging on my shirt asking if Santa was real, and Emily insisting on adding glitter to the ornaments, even though it ended up everywhere. I remembered the year their father left and how they clung to me on Christmas morning because the absence in the house felt too big for their small hearts. I remembered doing everything to make their holidays feel whole, even when I was falling apart. And now they wanted to hand all of that to someone who never scraped the ice off their car at 6 in the morning, never stayed up sewing their school costumes at midnight, never sat in the emergency room holding their hands while praying under her breath. They wanted the luxury version of motherhood, the polished version, the version that takes photos for social media and buys matching pajamas without understanding the weight behind the tradition. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger requires energy, and in that moment, I felt hollow, like they had scooped out the center of me and left just enough behind so I could smile politely. The next week, I received a group message from my ex-husband's wife. She wrote a detailed itinerary for Christmas, filled with imported decorations, champagne stockings, a three-course dinner, a photographer she hired, and notes about how the kids were excited to start new traditions that felt more modern and elegant. Not once did she mention me. Not once did my children add anything or even acknowledge that I was included in the thread only because she had probably felt obligated to add me. I stared at my phone for a long time, reading her message over and over. Modern. Elegant. New traditions. Those words cut deeper than any insult because they told me everything without saying it. I was outdated. I was plain. I was the old holiday they had outgrown, and she was the shiny, expensive replacement that made them feel important. I didn't respond. I placed the phone face down on the table and folded my hands, breathing slowly, forcing myself not to break. Tears would have been easier. Anger would have been easier. But I felt something else rising inside me, something colder and clearer, like a lake freezing over in winter. The kind of cold that doesn't scream. It plans. I spent December quietly, decorating my house alone, not out of hope that they would show up, but because I refused to let their abandonment dictate the rhythm of my life. I hung the lights the same way I had every year, draping them across the railing, placing the angel on top of the tree with the same careful hands that had done it since Matthew was born. But it was different this time. The house didn't feel warm. It felt like a museum exhibit of a life I used to have. Each ornament felt like evidence. Each cookie recipe felt like a relic. And for the first time in my entire motherhood, I realized I was the only one still holding onto memories that the new version of my children no longer cared to remember. The night before Christmas Eve, Emily called. Her voice was soft, slightly guilty, but not enough to stop her. She said the boys wanted to FaceTime me on Christmas morning, but I shouldn't come in person because it would be too crowded, and Kelly had already planned everything. I told her that was fine, even though my throat burned with the effort of keeping my voice calm. Then she said something that snapped the thread entirely. She said it with the innocence of someone who didn't realize she was cutting open her mother's heart. She said, "Mom, you understand that things just change, right? We're adults now. We want something fresh, fresh, as if I were stale bread." I ended the call gently, told her I loved her, told her to enjoy her Christmas, told her I would be fine. And I was. But not in the way she expected, because I finally understood. My children no longer valued me, they valued what I provided. And that is when everything inside me shifted. I didn't scream, I didn't chase, I didn't beg. I simply sat with the truth long enough for it to carve a new resolve inside me. If they didn't want me in their new life, then they didn't need the parts of my life that were holding theirs together. And they had no idea how much of their world still existed because of me. Christmas morning would come, and they would learn exactly what happens when a mother stops giving. Not out of revenge, but out of revelation, out of necessity, out of justice. Because I had raised them to honor the woman who built them, they chose to honor the woman who decorated them. And choices always come with a cost. Christmas Eve arrived with a coldness that seeped into the walls, the kind that doesn't come from the weather, but from the silence of a home that used to echo with laughter. I woke before the sun, the house dim and still, and stood in the doorway of the living room staring at the tree I decorated alone. Every ornament suddenly looked like a souvenir from a life I no longer had access to. The stockings I had knitted when they were little hung neatly on the fireplace, untouched, unnecessary. I placed gifts beneath the tree anyway, not because anyone would open them, but because I needed to prove to myself that I still knew how to be a mother, even when no one was watching. I made coffee, wrapped my hands around the warm mug, and walked to the window, watching snow fall in slow spirals outside, soft and peaceful, like the world didn't know it was witnessing the quietest heartbreak a woman could bear. I stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of my own breathing, waiting for pain to rise, but instead I felt a strange clarity, a sense of finality, as if something inside me had shifted from fragile to firm overnight. This wasn't loneliness anymore. It was recognition. Recognition that I had poured myself out year after year into children who had grown accustomed to being full, who had never wondered where the fullness came from, who assumed love was supposed to be convenient and unconditional, without understanding that unconditional doesn't mean invisible. It doesn't mean disposable. By mid morning, the phone buzzed with messages from Emily and Matthew, the kind of shallow holiday greetings sent out of obligation rather than love. Emily sent a picture of her boys in matching pajamas, their faces glowing in front of a towering tree in Kelly's house. The decorations looked expensive, color coordinated, like something clipped from a magazine. I studied the photo, searching their expressions for something real, something that resembled the warmth of the Christmas mornings I had given them for decades. But everything looked staged, polished, curated to please the woman behind the camera. And then the detail that stung the most, almost imperceptible unless you knew what to look for. My grandchildren were holding mugs with names printed in gold cursive. Mommy, Daddy, Nana Kelly. The absence of my name was louder than any insult they could have spoken. They had made space in their traditions for everyone, except the woman who created the traditions in the first place. I placed the phone face down without responding, not because I wanted to punish them, but because I finally understood silence was the only language they had left for me. Around noon, Matthew called, sounding rushed and distracted, probably pacing in a kitchen filled with dishes he didn't buy and expectations he didn't want to disappoint. He said they wouldn't have time for the FaceTime call in the morning, so maybe we could do it later in the afternoon, after dinner, if the boys weren't too tired. I told him that was fine, even though the dismissal lodged in my chest like a shard of glass. He hung up quickly, saying Kelly needed him. I stood in the middle of my kitchen, phone still warm in my hand, and felt something raw stir inside me. Not anger, not jealousy, something deeper, something older. The quiet heartbreak of realizing your role in your children's lives has been reduced to a placeholder for convenience, a backup plan for guilt. I had never wanted to be a holiday burden. But this year, they treated me like clutter in the corner of their perfectly lit Christmas world. That evening, I decided to take a drive. Not to escape the house, but to escape the feeling that I was suffocating inside it. The roads were icy, the sky heavy with snow clouds, and the neighborhoods I passed glowed with lights and families gathered around tables. I drove past my ex husband's street, slowing just enough to see the burst of brightness spilling from the windows of the house I once lived in. The laughter, the movement of silhouettes, the smell of pine drifting into the night air. It all belonged to a life that had moved on without me. I saw Kelly through the window, wearing a tight red dress, smiling with the confidence of a woman who had never carried the weight of raising those children through sickness, heartbreak, poverty, and long nights alone. She stood in my kitchen, stirring something on the stove, surrounded by people who used to be mine. My stomach twisted, but not from envy, from clarity. The clarity that nothing in that house was mine anymore. Not the memories, not the rituals, not even the people. I parked 2 blocks away, shutting off the engine, letting the cold air settle around me. I sat there gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, breathing slow, steady breaths as the truth finally took shape. My children weren't just rejecting me. They were rewriting their history without me. They were polishing the narrative, smoothing out the parts that made them uncomfortable, replacing the messy truth of who raised them with a brand new woman who fit better in their curated holiday photos. Kelly was the mother they wanted to present to the world. I was the mother they tucked away because my love wasn't glamorous enough. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't Instagram ready. It was real. And they had outgrown real because real requires gratitude, and gratitude requires humility. They weren't ready for that. They wanted ease. They wanted aesthetic. They wanted a mother who matched their new lives. I sat in that car until my breath fogged the windows, until the street was quiet, until the last of the guests arrived at my old home. The heaviness inside me didn't shatter. It condensed, becoming something sharp, something defined. The kind of emotion that doesn't erupt but crystallizes. I realized then that motherhood had turned into an unbalanced equation. They took, I gave, they forgot. I remembered, they replaced, I endured. They wanted to move forward with someone new, and they expected me to stand still, smiling politely, watching them build a life on top of the one I had sacrificed everything for. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to stand still anymore. I wanted to move too, not out of pettiness or revenge, but out of necessity. Because staying in a role they no longer valued was the cruelest thing I could do to myself. So I drove home. I walked into my quiet house. I locked the door behind me. And then I did something no one expected, not even me. I went to my office, pulled out the folders I had kept for years, the documents I touched once a year at most, the papers that tied my name to every crucial part of my children's lives. Bank accounts, emergency contacts, trust funds, property co-signatures, insurance beneficiaries, business access. I laid them out on the table one by one, my hands steady, my heart steady, my thoughts clearer than they had been in years. And as I stared at the arrangement of papers that represented decades of sacrifice, I finally understood the truth. They had replaced me emotionally long before they replaced me at Christmas. They just didn't realize I had the power to walk away too. And once a mother stops giving, the world her children took for granted begins to crumble. Tomorrow, they would wake up to their perfect Christmas. They had no idea what was coming after. Christmas morning arrived not with joy or noise or the warm rustle of wrapping paper, but with a silence so complete it felt like the house was holding its breath for me, as if the walls themselves had paused to watch what I was about to do. I woke before the sun, not because I had somewhere to be, but because years of motherhood had trained my body to rise early for children who no longer needed me at their table. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long moment, staring at the quiet hallway, remembering how many times I'd tiptoed through it carrying stockings or assembling toys at midnight so they'd wake to a world that felt magical. Today, there was no magic, no anticipation, just clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you realize the people you would die for don't even think you deserve a seat in their holiday photos. I walked into the kitchen, brewed a pot of coffee, and listened to the hum of the machine, letting the sound ground me. The tree in the living room still glowed faintly from the night before. lights twinkling with a softness that felt almost mocking, as if they were unaware that the woman who had once built Christmas with her bare hands was now observing it from the outside. I poured my coffee, wrapped myself in a shawl, and sat at the table as snow drifted past the window in slow, delicate spirals, landing gently on a world that felt so different from the one I used to belong to. My phone buzzed with a picture from Emily of the boys' opening presents, while Kelly sat on the couch smiling like the queen of a kingdom she didn't build. Matthew sent a video of everyone laughing around the tree, while Kelly's voice narrated the moment with the confidence of someone who believed she had earned her place. None of them noticed I wasn't there. None of them asked where I was. None of them even mentioned my name. They didn't need me this year. They had replaced me so seamlessly it frightened me how easily they let me slip out of the frame. I set my phone down and sipped my coffee as the sun finally pushed light across the snow, illuminating the folders still laid out on the dining table from the night before. The documents looked almost ceremonial, like a line of relics awaiting judgment. I walked over, placing my fingertips on the first stack, Matthew's emergency contacts. My name at the top, the person they called whenever life hit hard, whenever he crashed emotionally, financially, or physically. Emily's boys' school forms, where my name was listed not as grandmother, but as the secondary guardian because I was the only consistent adult in their lives before Kelly stepped in with her pretty dresses and curated smiles. My ex husband's business paperwork, where my signature appeared on contracts he couldn't have qualified for without my credit history. Insurance documents naming me as the executor because I had been the responsible one even after our marriage rotted beneath his infidelity. And then the accounts. The accounts they didn't even know I had access to. The ones I used to bail them out quietly, without lectures, without reminders of how often I had saved them. Car payments, school fees, security deposits, emergency loans, medical deductibles, groceries when they couldn't stretch their paychecks, birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. Vacations they bragged about but never actually paid for. My children weren't cruel people, they were comfortable. Too comfortable. Comfortable believing their mother would always be there, always cushioning their fall, always remaining silent, always offering unconditional support without expecting appreciation in return. But unconditional did not mean invisible. And the moment they replaced me with a woman who decorated better, cooked trendier meals, took prettier pictures, and called herself bonus mom, they severed the last thread holding them to the safety net they thought was guaranteed. I spent the next hour reading every document carefully, not out of spite, but out of understanding. When people show you where you stand in their lives, you owe it to yourself to adjust accordingly. I opened my laptop, the hum of the old machine filling the room with a low vibration, and logged into the accounts that had supported them without their knowledge. The cursor blinked patiently in the password fields, almost as if the universe itself was asking one last time whether I was ready. I was, not because I wanted to teach them a lesson, not because I wanted revenge, but because continuing to support children who no longer saw me as part of their family would have been the cruelest form of self betrayal. I began with the trust fund I had set up for Emily when she was 19, the one she assumed her father funded, because he enjoyed letting people believe he was more generous than he truly was. I removed my name as co signatory and transferred the maintenance authority to an attorney setting conditions for future withdrawals. Emily had always told me she didn't need my help, that she was independent. Today, for the first time, I decided to believe her. Then I opened Matthew's housing account. I removed myself from the automatic rent coverage I had set up when his hours were cut last year. He never thanked me. He never even asked how the rent was magically always on time. Now, he would learn what it meant to truly stand on his own 2 feet. One by one, I unraveled myself from the systems that kept their lives running smoothly. Car insurance. Gone. Health deductibles. Gone. Grocery card. Gone. Christmas savings account. Gone. Student loan cosigner. Removed. Emergency credit line. Cancelled. Every safety rope they had leaned on without acknowledging was quietly lifted away. As I worked, the truth settled deeper into my bones. They replaced me, not just for a holiday, not just for a dinner. They replaced me in their hearts with someone easier to display, someone shinier, someone who required none of the sacrifice but reaped all of the praise. And they assumed I would simply accept it, that I would continue to be the backstage worker in the theater of their lives. that I would applaud from afar each time they posted new traditions, new photos, new memories that erased the woman who built their childhood from grit and exhaustion and unshakable love. I finished removing myself from everything as mid-afternoon sunlight drifted across the table, turning the stack of documents golden at the edges, as if I were witnessing the sunset of an era. When the last update was complete, I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath that felt like it had been trapped inside me for decades. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter, something finally balanced. I walked to the fireplace, looked at the stockings hanging in a neat row, and gently took them down, folding them carefully, placing them in a wooden box I hadn't opened in years. Not out of anger, but out of acceptance. Some traditions aren't meant to be killed. They're meant to be retired when they no longer belong to the people they were created for. By evening, the phone buzzed again. Emily asking if I wanted to FaceTime before the boys opened the last of their presents. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling nothing but a calm stillness. They wanted the illusion of including me without the effort of truly making space for me. I typed a single message back. I'm spending Christmas quietly today. Enjoy your time together. I turned the phone face down. The chapter they wrote without me was finally theirs. And now, the chapter I would write for myself was finally mine. They had replaced me without hesitation. They had no idea I had the power to remove myself too. But the consequences of that removal were only beginning. The days following Christmas unfolded with a strange heaviness in the air, as if the world itself sensed a shift I had not spoken aloud, a shift that existed only in the quiet corners of my choices. I moved through my home with a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years, a stillness born not from loneliness but from clarity, the calm that comes when a woman finally steps out of a role she had been performing long after the audience stopped watching. I kept waiting for guilt to surface, but it never came. Instead, each morning felt like peeling away another layer of obligation that had been weighing on my shoulders for decades. I returned to ordinary routines, cooking for one, cleaning rooms that once overflowed with children's noise, and noticing how peaceful the house felt without the pressure of being everything to everyone. I didn't reach out. I didn't ask how their holiday had been. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't initiate the conversation, and the silence from their side was louder than any argument. It stretched over the next week, a vacant space in which I expected at least one of them to realize something was wrong, to sense that the woman who had carried them through every storm had finally gone quiet. But the silence remained unbroken, confirming what I already knew. They were too immersed in their shiny new holiday world to notice the absence of the woman who taught them how to celebrate in the first place. And that realization, as painful as it was, made the next steps easier. New Year's Eve arrived, and I decided, for the first time in a long while, to spend the evening outside my home. I didn't want to sit alone on the couch watching a countdown that meant nothing to me anymore, not when I had reached a turning point so significant it felt like stepping onto a new timeline. I put on a coat, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and walked to a small cafe at the edge of town, the kind of place no one I knew ever went. The cafe was warm, dimly lit, filled with older couples, quiet laughter, and the comforting hum of people living simple, honest lives. I found a corner seat by the window and watched snowflakes drift under the lamplight outside, swirling gently, unhurried. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I sipped my tea, letting the warmth spread through me, when an older woman at the table beside mine looked over and gave me a small smile, the kind of soft, knowing smile that women who have survived their own heartbreaks often share. She must have sensed something in the way I carried myself because she leaned closer and said in a gentle voice, "You look like someone who finally put herself first." The sentence hit me with unexpected force. I asked her what she meant, and she chuckled softly, stirring her coffee. Women like us learn to give until there's nothing left. Eventually, we reach a point where we realize giving doesn't mean being stepped on. It means knowing when to stop. Her words echoed inside me long after she returned to her conversation. When I left the cafe, the air was crisp, the town quiet, and as I walked home, I felt something I couldn't quite name settling into me, something that felt like the beginning of transformation. I reached my front porch just as my phone buzzed with a message. It was Matthew. "Mom, can you call me when you get a minute?" Something about the tone felt off, not urgent, not angry, but confused, as if for the first time he sensed something shifting beneath the surface. I didn't respond right away. I unlocked the door, stepped into my warm, quiet house, hung up my coat, and took a moment to breathe before I finally called him. He answered in the second ring, his voice strained in a way I hadn't heard in years. He said he had tried to pay his rent, and the payment failed. He assumed it was a glitch, but then his car insurance notice arrived saying coverage had lapsed. He said he didn't understand, that everything felt like it was unraveling at once, and I listened patiently, letting him speak until he finally asked the question he had been circling around. Mom, did something happen? Did something change? I could hear the unease in his voice, the tightening fear of a man who had never truly learned how to stand on his own because I had always held the rope steady for him. I stayed silent for a moment, not to punish him, but to gather my words, to choose honesty instead of cushioning the truth. I told him calmly that I had stepped back from responsibilities he never realized I was carrying. His breath caught on the line, and he asked what that meant, asked why I would do that without telling him. I explained what he chose not to see, that he and Emily had built a life in which I no longer had a place, that decisions were made without me, that holidays were held without me, that traditions I had created were handed to someone else without a second thought. I told him that love without reciprocity becomes a burden, and I was no longer willing to carry a burden for children who didn't see me unless they needed something. He was silent for a long time. I could hear him swallowing, the shock settling like stones in his chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was small, uncertain, as if he didn't recognize himself in the position he now stood in. He said he didn't mean to push me away, that things just got busy, that the holiday wasn't meant to be hurtful. But excuses were not apologies, and explanations were not acknowledgement. I told him I understood, that I wasn't angry, that I wasn't seeking revenge. I was simply stepping out of a role he had replaced without asking if I wanted to retire. He asked if Emily knew. I told him she would soon enough. After we hung up, I stood in the middle of my living room, surrounded by the glow of my decorations, and for the first time, I felt no yearning for the Christmas I wasn't invited to. Instead, I felt something sturdier forming inside me, the beginning of boundaries, the beginning of a life that wasn't built solely around the needs and comforts of other people. But deep down, I also sensed what was coming. Children who rely on a parent without appreciating them always expect the parent to be there when the world begins to crack. And cracks were coming. Their holidays had been glossy and perfect, but their stability, the foundation beneath the shiny surface, had always been built on my quiet support. I went upstairs, changed into comfortable clothes, and climbed into bed just after midnight, letting the weight of the blanket settle over me as the new year officially began. Somewhere across town, fireworks exploded faintly behind frosted windows, families cheered, glasses clinked, and people embraced the illusion of fresh starts. But my fresh start wasn't an illusion. It was deliberate, it was necessary. And as I closed my eyes, I realized something profound. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for my children to choose me, I was choosing myself. And in the days that followed, they would learn exactly what that meant. The fallout began quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a hairline fracture forming beneath a painted wall, hidden until the pressure becomes too much and the entire structure groans under its own weight. 3 days into the new year, the silence that had stretched comfortably around me was shattered by a call from Emily. Not the cheerful kind she used to make on her lunch breaks, but the panicked, tight-voiced kind she saved for when she didn't know what else to do. I let the phone ring longer than I normally would, not out of cruelty, but because I was no longer rushing to be the person who placed herself between my children and the consequences of their own indifference. When I finally answered, her breath came fast, as if she had been pacing. She said the boys' school had contacted her because the tuition payment hadn't gone through and a second late notice had been mailed. She said she didn't understand because she thought the payments were automated. She thought everything was taken care of. She thought the system was handling it, unaware the system was me. She waited for me to reassure her the way I always did, to tell her I would look into it, to promise that the boys would not miss a day of school, and I could almost hear the moment her breath hitched when I didn't jump in to solve anything. Instead, I asked her if she wanted me to explain the truth or if she preferred to keep believing someone else was responsible for everything she took for granted. She froze, and for the first time in years, I heard the unmistakable sound of her pride cracking. She whispered that she wanted the truth, so I told her. I told her gently but clearly that the reason the payments were always on time was because I had been paying them. Not her, not her father, not Kelly, me. The woman they uninvited from Christmas because she didn't fit the aesthetic they were curating. Her silence on the line was sharp enough to cut the air between us. Then came the shock, the disbelief, the excuses, the flustered attempt to rewrite history in real time as she tried to make sense of the reality she had never bothered to understand. She said she didn't know. She said she never asked because she assumed her father was handling it. She said Kelly mentioned something once about helping with the kids' expenses, and she assumed that meant everything was covered. Assumed, assumed, that word hung between us like a verdict. I let her talk until she exhausted herself, until her voice wavered into a fragile tremble as she finally asked the question she had been avoiding since Christmas. Why didn't you tell me? I thought you didn't need me in that way anymore, I said softly. You made it very clear that your new traditions didn't include me. She inhaled sharply, and before she could respond, a baby cried in the background, followed by Kelly's voice calling her from another room. Emily lowered her voice, almost embarrassed as she whispered that she didn't mean to hurt me, that they were just excited about something new, that Kelly had been enthusiastic about taking over the holidays, and that she didn't think it mattered where they celebrated as long as we were still family. The irony struck me so hard I almost laughed. They weren't celebrating with me. They were celebrating without me. And now that the scaffolding of their lives was beginning to shake, they suddenly remembered I existed. Before Emily could ask anything else, I told her calmly that I loved my grandchildren deeply. But I was no longer willing to be the invisible backbone, holding everything up while being treated like the decorative piece they no longer wanted on display. I told her that moving forward, she and her husband were responsible for their own commitments, their own payments, their own choices. Her voice thinned with panic, the kind that comes from realizing the floor beneath you was never solid. She asked me what she was supposed to do now. I told her she would do what every adult must do. She would figure it out. When I hung up, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, firm, alive in a way I hadn't felt in over a decade. There is a particular strength that rises in a mother when she finally chooses herself. A strength that is not cruel but uncompromising, not vindictive but necessary. I breathed deeply and returned to my morning, making tea, opening the curtains to let in pale winter sunlight, and sitting in my quiet living room with a calmness that felt earned. The next wave came from my ex-husband. He called me that afternoon, his voice thick with irritation disguised as concern. He asked if something had happened between me and the kids, because both of them had called him that morning asking questions about bills he didn't even know existed. He sounded flustered, like a man being dragged into a responsibility he thought he had outsourced indefinitely. I told him bluntly that his children's financial stability had been built on the back of my sacrifices. He scoffed as if he couldn't believe I dared to claim the truth and said he didn't understand why I would withdraw support so suddenly. I told him it wasn't sudden at all. It had been a long time coming. My voice remained calm while his grew defensive, and beneath the veneer of irritation, I could hear something else forming in him. Fear. Fear that the comfort he had enjoyed because of my quiet generosity was cracking. Fear that the image he maintained of himself as a capable provider was dissolving now that his children were seeing the truth. He asked what I expected them to do, and I answered plainly. Grow up. Stand on their own, appreciate what was given to them instead of assuming it was their right. He muttered something about me being dramatic, but the weakness in his tone told me he understood perfectly well that this wasn't drama. This was accountability, and he wasn't prepared for it. The next day, the consequences that had begun as small ripples turned into undeniable waves. Emily called again, this time crying so hard she could barely get words out, telling me their mortgage payment was unexpectedly short, that she didn't realize how many expenses I had been covering quietly in the background. She asked why I never told her. I told her I did, many times, but she had never really listened. She begged me for a temporary extension of help, just until next month. I took a long breath before answering, because this was the moment I knew would come, the moment where I had to decide whether to step back fully or give in to old habits. And I chose to step back. I told her gently but firmly that she had a partner, a household, a family unit now, and that it was no longer my responsibility to rescue her from the consequences of her own blindness. She sobbed harder, and for a moment, the mother in me wanted to drive over, hold her, fix everything the way I always did. But the woman in me, the woman who wiped her own tears on Christmas morning, the woman who hung stockings alone, the woman who was replaced without hesitation, kept me grounded. Matthew's call came next, and his voice was not panicked like Emily's but angry, a brittle anger that cracks at the edges. He demanded to know why I had cut off payments without warning. He said it wasn't fair, that he relied on me, that I had always been the one to step in. I told him that was exactly the problem. He had expected me to endure being sidelined as a parent while continuing to shoulder the burdens of one. He complained that I was punishing them for choosing to spend Christmas differently. I told him I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply matching their energy. They wanted independence from me. Now they had it. After I ended the call, I stood at the window watching snow fall against the streetlights, soft and soundless, and felt something inside me settle with an almost sacred stillness. This was not revenge. This was rebalancing. This was reclaiming dignity. This was what happened when a mother stopped giving to children who only remembered her when something needed to be fixed. I knew this was only the beginning. Their safety net had been cut. Their structure was cracking. Their comfortable ignorance was collapsing. And in the coming days, they would realize the truth they had refused to see. It wasn't their stepmother who made their world stable. It was me. And the moment they removed me, the world they depended on began to fall apart. The week that followed unfolded like watching a tapestry unravel, thread by thread in slow motion, each strand snapping under the weight of truths my children had spent years avoiding. It began with small inconveniences, cracks that could still be patched if someone moved quickly enough, but none of them were prepared for the magnitude of what holding responsibility truly meant. Emily called one morning saying her car insurance payment was declined. She didn't understand why because she thought it was still on auto debit. I reminded her gently that the auto debit had always been connected to my account, not hers. She fell silent, and in that silence, I could hear the sound of her world shifting, like furniture being moved in a dark room. Her voice eventually cracked as she admitted she had no idea her life had been cushioned by my financial presence to such a degree. She always assumed her father contributed more than he did, always assumed Kelly brought more to the table than her Pinterest perfect Christmas setups. It was only now, in the quiet dismantling of their assumptions, that she began to understand the scale of my sacrifice. Matthew's unraveling was different. He was prideful in a way that had always reminded me of his father, the kind of pride that stands tall until the storm hits, and then folds quickly when the illusion of control disappears. He had been living in a condo I purchased years ago, under the agreement that he would take over the mortgage after his promotion. The promotion never happened, but I never pushed him. I simply paid the remainder each month without telling him. He found out the truth when he got a notice from the bank that the automatic payment had been removed and the remaining balance was due in 20 days. He called me, his tone sharp and defensive, accusing me of blindsiding him. I listened to his anger, patient in a way only a mother can be when she knows the rage is a desperate attempt to hide panic. When he finished, breathless and waiting for me to fix everything as I always had, I told him calmly that I had been carrying him quietly for far too long. He tried to argue that this was not the time for lectures, that he was already under pressure with work, that I should have told him sooner. I told him that the time for warnings ended the moment he decided to replace me, intentionally or not, with a woman who had never held a fraction of the weight I carried. The truth sat heavily between us, and though he tried to mask it, I heard the first crack in his composure. Meanwhile, Kelly had begun to sense the shift. Her curated calm was slipping. I heard this not from the children, but through the quiet undercurrents of people who knew how to read changing tides. She had built her entire persona on seamless perfection, effortless control, and the illusion that she elevated the family simply by existing in it. But now the cracks in the foundation were loud enough for her to hear. Emily confided in me that Kelly had begun asking uncomfortable questions around the house. Why was the credit card she used for grocery orders suddenly declined? Why were the children's extracurricular activities on hold? Why did the housekeeper cancel? Because there was an outstanding, unpaid balance. Why was the holiday trip to Aspen suddenly off the table with a cancellation fee they could not cover? These were things Kelly was not used to confronting. She was used to being the center of a polished world someone else maintained. The truth was she had stepped into a kingdom she thought my ex-husband built. She thought she was marrying into stability, into a secure and predictable life. She never questioned how that stability stayed intact even when his career plateaued and her designer tastes expanded. She never wondered why the children's expenses never became a burden. She didn't ask how the mortgage, the tuition, the car insurance, the medical deductibles, the family trips, and the holiday extravaganzas continued at such ease. She assumed. She assumed the way my children assumed. She assumed the way my ex-husband encouraged everyone to assume, because assumptions cost nothing. Assumptions make life look prettier. Assumptions prevent truth from getting in the way of comfort. But assumptions crumble quickly under the weight of reality, and reality was arriving in full. 3 days later, I received a call from the boys' school. They needed updated financial information for tuition continuation since the primary payer on the account had been removed. They assumed it was a technical issue. I explained politely that it was not. I told them to contact the children's parents directly. The administrator sounded surprised but thanked me and said they would follow up immediately. As soon as I hung up, I imagined the message landing in Emily's inbox, the first ripple of a life built on invisible scaffolding suddenly exposed. I made tea and sat in the living room, looking out at the early evening sky turning a muted gold. There was no vengeance in my actions. There was no desire for suffering. There was only the steady understanding that sometimes the greatest mistake a mother can make is protecting her children so thoroughly they begin to believe the world is not something they must carry themselves. By the end of the week, Emily was unraveling in ways I had never witnessed. She called me one night nearly breathless, saying they were behind on utilities because she didn't know her father had not been paying any of the household bills. She admitted that she and Kelly had assumed everything was handled automatically because they were always fine at month's end. She said she never learned to budget because she never needed to. She said she didn't know what to do. She said she was scared. Her voice broke when she said she finally understood what I meant on Christmas morning, that she had taken me for granted. That replacing me had not been a symbolic choice. It was a severing of the very foundation she depended on. I could hear her shame, her guilt, and something else, a kind of awakening, the beginning of self-awareness. Matthew reached that moment too, though in a harder, more painful way. His job cut his hours. His credit card was declined. He discovered the tax bill for his condo was much higher than he expected because he had never once opened the mail himself. He called me late at night, not angry this time, but hollow. He said he always thought his father was the reason their lives stayed comfortable. He said he felt stupid. He said he didn't realize how much of their world was held together because of me. He asked me how I managed so much without ever asking for recognition. I told him quietly that I didn't need applause for raising them. I didn't need acknowledgement, but I needed respect. And the day they uninvited me from Christmas was the day they made it clear they valued performative affection over genuine loyalty. As the children grappled with their unraveling lives, I saw something else happening, something subtle but deeply important. They were beginning to talk to each other, not out of convenience but necessity. Emily confessed to Matthew that she had been leaning financially on me. Matthew admitted the same. Both were stunned to realize they had been receiving the same invisible support without ever knowing it. They both began to understand that their father had been comfortable because I made sure he never faced the full weight of responsibility. They began to understand that Kelly had enjoyed a lifestyle built on a foundation she assumed was hers. And they began to understand what I meant when I said that a mother does not disappear simply because someone else tries to take her place. In the middle of all this, I stayed calm. I stayed steady. I answered their calls when I chose to, not out of spite, but because I was no longer rushing to solve problems for people who didn't see me as essential until the ground started shaking. This was not a punishment. This was a re-education, a resetting, a quiet return of equilibrium. I moved through my days with a peace I had not known in years. I cooked meals for myself, read books I had neglected, walked through the soft winter air with my coat tied tightly around me, and felt the weight of motherhood shift from carrying to guiding. The moment that sealed the shift came on a Sunday afternoon when Emily called and asked if she could come see me. Not for money, not for help, but to talk, to listen, to understand. That was when I knew the turning point had begun, not the end. Not the resolution, but the beginning of their understanding that a mother is not replaceable. A mother is not a decorative piece to be swapped out for someone shinier. A mother is the ground beneath a family. And when that ground is removed, everything built on top begins to shake. The day Emily arrived at my door was the first time in years I saw my daughter stripped of the performance she had curated for the world, stripped of the glossy confidence she wore like an accessory, stripped of the entitlement that had once seemed as natural to her as breathing. She stood on my porch shivering in a thin coat that was more aesthetic than functional, her eyes swollen from crying, her hair tied back messily, as if she had pulled it up during an argument and never fixed it. When I opened the door, she didn't rush in or collapse into my arms the way she used to when she was little. She stood there quietly, like a visitor unsure if she was welcome. And for the first time in a long time, I saw the young woman she could have been if she hadn't built her identity on comfort she never earned and approval she never questioned. She asked softly if she could come in, and I stepped aside without speaking, letting her walk into the warm living room she had abandoned for a curated life in a house that was never truly hers. She looked around like she was seeing it again for the first time. Her gaze lingering on the framed photos she once claimed were too old-fashioned on the knitted throw her grandmother, made decades ago on the quiet steadiness of the space she had taken for granted, until life outside it began to collapse. She sat on the couch, her hands trembling in her lap, and for a long time she didn't speak. When she finally did, her voice broke, not with anger this time, but with the fragile honesty of someone who had run out of excuses. She said she didn't come for money. She didn't come for help. She didn't come to negotiate. She came because everything felt like it was falling apart, and she didn't know who she was anymore without the illusion of stability she once believed was her birthright. She said the boys had been asking questions about why their activities were suddenly paused, why Christmas gifts were late, why she seemed stressed all the time. She admitted she felt ashamed, not because her life was harder now, but because she was realizing she had never appreciated the life she had before. She said she felt stupid for letting a woman she barely knew slide so easily into a place she didn't realize was irreplaceable. She said she didn't see the moment she lost herself because she had been so eager to prove she could build a perfect family that she didn't notice she was pushing away the only person who actually held the blueprint for how to build anything real. I listened. Not with the indulgent patience I used to offer, not with the urge to rescue her, but with the steady heart of a mother who had learned to love without enabling. She asked me why I didn't tell her sooner, why I didn't warn her, why I didn't stop her from drifting so far away. I told her the truth, that I had tried, many times, in quiet moments when she was too distracted to hear. In small warnings she brushed aside. In conversations where she laughed and said I took things too seriously. I told her that love is not control. A mother cannot force an adult child to see what they refuse to look at. I told her that sometimes you must let a tree bend until it feels the tension in its own branches. She cried harder then, hiding her face in her hands, not because of the consequences, but because she finally understood how long I had been holding the weight alone. She whispered that she felt sick knowing she had replaced me without hesitation, that she let a holiday aesthetic matter more than the woman who had built every Christmas she ever loved. She said she thought Kelly's excitement, her Pinterest boards, her perfect table settings meant she cared. She didn't realize that appearance is not substance. That cheer is not commitment. That staging is not love. She finally admitted that the pressure was too much now. That the bills, the school, the groceries, the house, the endless list of responsibilities felt like an avalanche she could not outrun. She confessed that Kelly had grown distant since the money stopped, her warm enthusiasm replaced by irritation and blame, and that Emily felt like she was carrying everything alone. She said she felt abandoned, even though she was the one who had abandoned me first. The irony softened something inside me, but I did not let it make me weak. I told her that what she was feeling was not punishment. It was adulthood. It was reality. It was the lesson she was always going to face, whether now or later. We talked for hours, not as mother and child, but as two women standing in the rubble of choices they both contributed to. She apologized without excuses, without performance, without the exaggerated emotion she used to fall back on. It was raw, it was real. It was the beginning of something we hadn't had in years: accountability. When she finally left, she didn't ask me to fix anything. She didn't ask for checks or transfers or shortcuts. She asked for guidance. She asked how to budget, how to save, how to say no, how to stand firm. She asked how I had survived when I was her age with two children and a failing marriage. She asked if I hated her. I told her I never hated her. I hated the version of her that believed love was performance, that believed money was unconditional, that believed replacing someone was the same as outgrowing them. She hugged me tightly before leaving, and it was the first hug she gave me in years that didn't feel rehearsed. Matthew's reckoning came later, slower, and more jagged. He arrived unexpectedly one evening after work, looking exhausted in a way that didn't come from physical labor, but from the emotional erosion of a man who no longer believed in the illusion he built his identity on. He walked into my home without waiting for permission, like he used to when he was a teenager, and sat at the kitchen table while I finished cooking dinner. He didn't speak until I turned off the stove and sat across from him. He said he had lost count of the financial disasters he discovered in the last few days. He said he felt like he was unraveling faster than he could hold on. He admitted he had spent years thinking his father was the strong one, the stable one, the one who kept everything going. Now he realized his father had been carried by someone he instructed them to overlook. He said he didn't understand how I could love someone so thoroughly without ever asking for recognition. He said it made him feel small for treating me the way he had. He confessed that he had always been angry and he didn't know why, but now he realized it was guilt disguised as frustration. Guilt that I worked so hard, guilt that I gave so much, guilt that I made everything look easy, so they assumed it required no effort. He apologized too, not with theatrics, but with sincerity that felt heavy and real. He asked me how to rebuild, how to become a man who didn't hide behind assumptions or entitlement. He asked how to start over without feeling like a failure. I told him the same truth I told Emily. You start by standing up on your own feet. You keep standing even when it hurts. You keep moving even when you are afraid. And you learn to appreciate not the people who decorate your life, but the ones who build it with you. When he left that night, he didn't slam the door like he used to when he was frustrated. He closed it gently, as if afraid to disturb the quiet he had discovered inside himself. As both my children began to shift, I felt a strange clarity settle over me. I didn't need them to grovel. I didn't need them to repay every burden. I didn't need anything from them except awareness, respect, gratitude. And for the first time in years, they were beginning to see who I really was: not the backup parent, not the optional guest, not the person who disappears when someone prettier steps in. They were beginning to understand that the mother they dismissed so easily was the architect of everything they leaned on. The reckoning was not over. Kelly had not yet revealed her part in this unraveling, and my ex-husband still believed he could manipulate the narrative in his favor. But the children were waking up, slowly, painfully, necessarily. And once your children finally see the truth, the rest of the world has no place to hide. The unraveling of Kelly and my ex-husband did not arrive like a storm crashing through the windows, but rather like a slow leak that finally becomes impossible to ignore, the kind that rots the floorboards long before anyone smells the mildew. It began with a call from the boys' school, requesting an in-person meeting with both parents after repeated attempts to collect tuition had gone unanswered. Emily told me later that Kelly insisted she could handle it and wanted to present herself as the calm matriarch who only needed to make a phone call to smooth things over. But when they arrived and the head administrator explained the outstanding balance, Kelly's confidence fractured. She tried to charm her way through it, smiling too brightly, speaking with the polished poise she used in social settings, insisting that it must be an accounting error. But the administrator pulled up records on a screen that showed months of overdue notices sent to the same household Kelly claimed to manage flawlessly. Emily said the moment the truth reflected back at Kelly in the administrator's tone, the sparkle in her eyes dulled, revealing a flicker of fear she had been hiding beneath curated confidence. When they left the school, Emily told me she could feel something between them shift, like a rope snapping under tension. Kelly grew cold, angry even, snapping at the children in the car when they asked if they were still going to their activities after school. My ex husband contacted Emily later that day, furious and confused, asking why he had been included in a tuition meeting without any warning. Emily said she told him plainly that he was the parent listed on all school records, and his voice cracked when he heard the surprise in her tone. He told her he thought I was still taking care of everything because I always had. Emily said something in her broke then, hearing her father confirm that he had relied on me so completely that he never even checked his own children's paperwork. She asked him why he never paid attention. He said he thought I preferred handling things. She asked him why he let Kelly take over the holidays when he knew what I had done for years. He said Kelly wanted it, and he did not want conflict. The simplicity of his excuses angered Emily in a way she had never experienced. She told me later she hung up on him mid-sentence. Kelly's mask began to crumble quickly after that. Emily called me late one evening whispering so the kids would not hear. She said Kelly had started blaming her for everything, saying Emily should have known about the bills, that it was unfair to rely on her for everything, as if Emily had not been relying on me her entire life. She said Kelly kept bringing up Christmas, insisting she only took the lead because she thought the family needed something new and exciting, and that she never meant to replace anyone. But beneath her defensiveness was a quiet panic because she was finally realizing she married a man who contributed less to the household than she knew, and she blended a family built on scaffolding she did not understand. She was realizing she was not a replacement for anything. She was an accessory added to a structure she assumed was strong simply because there was no visible strain. The final crack came on a day Emily will probably remember forever. She told me she had asked Kelly to sit down and discuss finances honestly so she could understand what they could realistically afford now. She said Kelly reacted as if Emily had insulted her, accusing her of being dramatic, of blowing things out of proportion, of embarrassing her by telling people they were struggling. She said Kelly insisted they deserved a certain lifestyle and that cutting back was unacceptable. It was then Emily said something I never expected her to say. She told her stepmother that wanting something does not obligate another woman to sacrifice herself to provide it. Kelly went silent, stunned, and Emily told me she watched her stepmother's expression shift from superiority to horror as she realized that for the first time, Emily was not defending her, not hiding behind her, not chasing her approval. She was standing up straight, the way I used to stand when the world expected me to bow. My ex-husband, on the other hand, faced his reckoning much more directly. He called me one evening, trying to mask desperation with irritation, telling me the kids were overwhelmed and it was unfair for me to pull away all at once. He said I had created chaos. I let him speak until his voice lost the authority he was trying to wield. When I finally responded, I reminded him that chaos was never created by truth. Chaos is created by lies that were never acknowledged. I reminded him I had supported the children not because I was obligated, but because I loved them, and I had never once interfered when he chose a new life. But replacing me in the eyes of our children by handing the holidays to a woman who never knew how deeply that time meant to us was not a neutral choice. It was a message, and I heard it clearly. He grew quiet then, and the silence stretched long enough that I realized he finally understood the gravity of everything he had ignored. He knew Kelly was not built to carry a family. He knew Emily and Matthew relied on me more than they admitted. He knew he had allowed distance to grow so wide that he could not fix it with a few defensive words. He finally said he was sorry. It was not enough, but it was something. As all these truths collided, my home remained peaceful. I tended to my plants, lit candles in the evenings, cooked simple meals, read books, and moved with a steadiness that felt earned. For years, I had been the quiet force that held broken pieces together while being treated as replaceable, as optional, as someone who should gracefully step aside for a woman whose only qualification for motherhood was enthusiasm and holiday decor. Now the truth was unfolding. Not loudly, not vindictively, but clearly. The day Emily returned again, this time with the boys, I watched them run through my living room with the familiarity of childhood, and I felt a warmth I had missed. They brought drawings for me, drawings of Christmas trees and snowmen and hearts with my name written in block letters. Emily stood behind them quietly, watching me watch her children, and I could see something different in her eyes. Not entitlement, not expectation, but gratitude. She asked me if I wanted to join them for dinner the following week, not for a holiday, not to fix anything, but simply to be with them. I said yes, not because I needed proof that they still loved me, but because I could finally see they were beginning to understand the meaning of love itself. The storm had not yet fully settled. One more part of the reckoning remained. Kelly's mask had fractured, but she had not yet confronted the truth that the life she tried to curate was built on the quiet sacrifices of a woman she erased from the picture. And my children, though changing, were not yet standing on fully steady ground. But they were no longer blind. They were no longer assuming. They were beginning to grow, and the final part of their transformation was about to arrive, whether they were ready or not. The final reckoning came quietly, arriving not with confrontation or screaming, but with a stillness that felt almost sacred, as if the universe itself had paused to exhale. It was 2 weeks before Christmas when Emily called and asked if I could come over for dinner, not to help them, not to mediate anything, but simply to be present. I hesitated for a moment, remembering the sting of last year's exclusion, but something in her voice told me this time was different. When I arrived, the house was warm with the soft glow of string lights, not the curated perfection Kelly used to orchestrate, but something simpler, more intimate, more real. The boys ran to me as soon as I stepped inside, their arms wrapping around my waist, their laughter echoing in the hallway in a way that felt like a small miracle. Emily stood behind them, and when our eyes met, there was no shame or performance in her expression, only a quiet humility that softened her features. She hugged me too, not the brisk, obligatory hug from before, but a long embrace that held apology, gratitude, and a kind of newfound understanding she had earned through the hard work of facing her own choices. Matthew arrived shortly after, carrying groceries, and when he saw me, he set the bags down and hugged me as well, something he had not done since he was a teenager. He didn't speak at first, but he didn't have to. His grip was apology enough. We all sat down to a simple meal, pasta and salad and warm bread, nothing extravagant, nothing staged for social media, just a family trying to rebuild quietly. The boys chattered about school and games and Christmas lists, and the sound filled the space between us that had once been raw and painful. Emily poured me tea and then sat across from me, her hands wrapped around her mug, her eyes soft but steady. She told me she had been budgeting carefully, learning to manage bills, learning to live within what she earned, learning to say no to things that only existed for show. She said it was hard, harder than she ever imagined, but for the first time in her life, she felt proud of what she managed instead of assuming it would appear without cost. She thanked me, not for money, not for sacrifice, but for stepping back when she needed to learn how to stand on her own. Matthew joined her in that admission, saying he had been forcing himself to face realities he avoided for years, that he was saving now, cutting back, paying his own obligations, and beginning to understand why I had always been so firm about responsibility. He told me he never realized how much strength it took to carry a family invisibly. He said he finally respected me in the way he should have respected me all along. And then, inevitably, the conversation shifted to Kelly and their father. Emily told me that Kelly had moved out a few days earlier after a dramatic argument about finances, saying she was not built to live a life without certainty and comfort. Emily said she looked into Kelly's eyes during that fight and realized that her stepmother had never intended to build a family, only to manage an image. When the image cracked, she left. Their father had tried to smooth things over, blaming stress and misunderstanding, but the children saw through him now. They saw the patterns he had repeated for years, the avoidance, the entitlement, the willingness to let someone else carry the burden and then take the credit. They confronted him, not with cruelty but with clarity, telling him they were done living in illusions. He had no response because for the first time, his children were holding him accountable. After dinner, the boys brought out a box of ornaments, some old, some new, all mismatched in the most beautiful way. Emily asked if I would help them decorate their tree. I felt something inside me tremble, a deep ache releasing its hold, because a year ago I had been replaced, uninvited, erased from the traditions I spent decades building. And now here I was, standing beside a tree bare and waiting for us to fill it with meaning. We hung the ornaments one by one, the boys handing me pieces they liked most, telling me where to place them. Emily watched us, her eyes glistening, and when we stepped back to admire the finished tree, she whispered that she finally understood the weight of holidays. It wasn't the aesthetic or the decorations or the curated illusion of joy. It was the people who show up, who work quietly, who sacrifice without applause, who carry the traditions on their backs because love is their language. She said she had forgotten that. She said she was sorry. I nodded, not needing anything more from her because the truth was already alive in the room. As the evening went on, Emily brought out a small box and placed it in my hands. It wasn't wrapped or glamorous, just a plain cardboard box with my name written in her handwriting. Inside was a single ornament, handmade by the boys, a small heart shaped from clay with the words "Our real Christmas begins with you" carved into it. I held it carefully, feeling the tremor of emotion rise in my chest. And when I looked up, both of my children were watching me with expressions that carried years of unspoken love, regret, and reconciliation. I hung the ornament at the center of the tree, where the lights made it glow softly. And for the first time since the unraveling began, I felt the weight I had carried alone for so long finally shift. Before I left that night, Emily walked me to the door and said something I will remember for the rest of my life. She said that losing me for a while was the most painful experience she had ever faced, but it taught her the truth she had been too blind to see. That mothers are not replaceable. That love cannot be substituted. That stability is not a prop. That the person who quietly builds your world is not an accessory you remove when someone new enters it. She said she hoped this Christmas would be the first of many, where we rebuild not from illusion, but from honesty. I hugged her, and this time when she held on, it wasn't out of fear or desperation. It was out of love. As I drove home under the gentle glow of the winter moon, I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with restoration. My children had grown, they had fallen, they had learned, they had returned. And this time they came back as people ready to build something real. I stepped into my house, turned on the lights, and smiled at the quiet. The journey had been painful, messy, necessary. But justice had arrived not through punishment, but through truth. And healing had followed naturally. My children finally saw me, not the woman they dismissed, not the mother they replaced, but the foundation beneath their lives. And this Christmas, for the first time in years, I was not the forgotten guest. I was home. If this story reminded you that mothers are not replaceable and love is not a convenience, hit that like button and subscribe. Here, we tell the stories that expose entitlement, honor sacrifice, and restore the truth one chapter at a time. More real, raw family reckonings are coming.